Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Christine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Welcome to Conversations from the Edge. This is your host, Christine Madera, and I'm here today with Amber Mehresh. Now, Amber is a fascinating woman, and she actually is working with Nikola Tesla in some really interesting ways that we're going to get into during this podcast. But basically, she had spent most of her life exploring a variety of paths unrelated to a typical career, and then a health crisis drove her into an extended sabbatical. And while she was in that, she sought deeper meaning and purpose for her existence. And in this search, and unaware of who he was, she called on the soul of Nikola Tesla. And as it turned out, Nikola and Amber are twin flames or twin souls that are working together in different times, but together to do some very specific work in the world. Amber now spends her days exploring her relationship with Nikola, and they create the world that they have always dreamed of. So welcome, Amber. I'm really excited to be talking with you.
Thank you. I'm truly excited to be here.
There's a lot of people out there who are channeling Nikola Tesla, who are working with him in a variety of ways. Some people who are doing things like the tech aspect, some people who are doing things like the Atlantis aspect, which we may or may not get into, but the whole connection of Nikola Tesla with Atlantis and those energies and all kinds of other ways. But you have a really specific and I think profound way that you are working with Nikola Tesla, and that is around love and around his love life and opening his heart. So can you tell us a little bit about how this came to be?
Yes, it's in fact, when you say that and talk about other people channeling him for his technology, his free energy, it was a long journey for me to discover why he was present in my life and to what end, because I'm not involved in technology. In fact, when I took physics back in high school and college, electricity, I'm sorry to say, was the most confusing part of it. I aced every other part of physics but that.
Uh-huh.
So it's strange. You would think I would do better. However, when he first came into my life, which was August 2019,
Mm-hmm.
it was for the purpose of me inquiring about some electrical devices. And for the longest time, I confined myself to asking him about electrical questions and electrical discussions
Mm-hmm.
because I truly thought that a man like Nikola Tesla, that's all he really cared about, or all that he would be. How would I say? I very much wanted him around. I enjoyed his
Mm-hmm.
conversations and his company, and I had no idea that he would be interested in me personally for anything other than electrical issues.
So before we get deeper into that, can you tell people how, like when you say that you enjoy your conversations, when you connect with Tesla, how does that work for you? Because, you've got a really interesting relationship.
Oh, yeah, I think I take it for granted sometimes that I have the gift of being able to talk with spirit and
Mm-hmm.
connect with others in that realm. And it's been a gift that has been years long in discovering. And when I did discover it, of course, I used it for all the usual things that people use in their lives, like, hey, I need help with this. Hey, I'm really struggling with this. like, oh my gosh, I'm almost out of money. Please, can you help me find this job or get this job, or all the
Mhm.
typical things. And so when I called him into my life, it was really I was very much looking from a very physical life perspective,
Mhm.
that he was just another spirit that, I was asking him for guidance. And he stuck around. Like I had an initial conversation with him about the electrical devices, and then he kept just showing up. I mean, I called him in day
Mhm.
after day on one pretense or another,
Uh-huh.
as I was hardwiring my house and other projects. And after a couple weeks of that, I was running out of electrical questions to call him in about. But I
Uh-huh.
still wanted to see him. And
Uh-huh.
he just started showing up on my dog walks and
Mhm.
talking. And eventually he was there like pretty much all day long.
Mhm.
But I was really baffled by this. I was confused. I'm like, okay, I'm really happy to have this new spirit guide in my life. I'm not entirely sure why he's hanging out with me to the extent that he is,
Mhm.
but I was just simply so happy that he was in my life that I didn't ask too many questions at the time. However, when once he was there and once I was seeing him every day,
Mhm.
it was just a matter of time before my personal struggles started to seep into my conversations with him.
Mhm.
And what began as sort of a advisor relationship that I saw him as, quickly grew into a closer friendship.
Okay.
And from there grew even deeper. And then through our various adventures together, within a couple months of meeting him, he began to tell me things like that, I'm his twin soul or
Mhm.
twin flame, which was a term that I had never heard of back then.
Mhm.
And so as I began exploring that and what that meant, suddenly he was telling me about his pigeon and that he loved this pigeon. And so it became this whole romantic love drama and love story between him and I that I had, like, on a physical incarnation level, I had had no clue about that this relationship existed for me. And so when I began to explore this relationship, I found it completely exciting and surprising. And first several months of being in that with him, I was just in complete awe and constantly pinching myself, saying, "Oh, this can't be real. You can't really love me. I don't even understand what's going on with my life." I was as confused as much as I was falling in love with him.
So, and you just said briefly there that he was telling you about his pigeon. Now, that turns out to be really significant because Nikola Tesla, as we know him from history, from our history, didn't have a wife. He didn't really have, female company, but he did have this great love story with a pigeon. And so tell us a little bit about that and how you fit into that.
Yes, the first time that I heard about his being in love with a pigeon was as I was reading his biography, Prodigal Genius, and I'd flipped to the back and read the story in there of if anybody knows of Nikola Tesla and his life story, an almost famous statement of his saying, "Yes, I loved that pigeon. I loved her like a man loves a woman, and she loved me."
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that story of him falling in love with the pigeon and then her flying into the room one night and dying, right in front of him, and then shining this brilliant light onto him as she was dying. And I read this in his biography, and I just was completely overcome with emotion. And I didn't understand why I felt so intensely. And over the next few weeks, He didn't tell me directly because he really wanted me to figure it out myself,
Mm-hmm.
that I was actually the soul of that pigeon, and who had come as a pigeon simply to be with him, to be a presence in his physical life. And as we all know, he had pushed women out of his life. And
Mm-hmm.
so, one way or another, I was going to find a way to be with him. And so it was as a pigeon. And he recognized my soul right away
Mm-hmm.
within that pigeon. And he connected to the point that when I died right in front of him, he truly grieved as if his wife had just died. His wife had just passed away. That's how
Wow.
intensely he felt. And so as I was discovering this about him, and then finally opening myself up to that story and to the reality that I am actually that pigeon, I am that same person, that same soul who is that connected with him, who he fell in love with, even in the form of a pigeon, because we were connected on a soul level and
Mm-hmm.
he recognized me on that level.
Wow. That's really, really profound and interesting to me because, Nikola Tesla, again, was famously not involved with a woman during his life as we know it. And he was really kind of focused on his mind, focused on the mental work, focused on the experimentation and bringing these energies through. So as he's bringing these energies through, he's bringing it through from the mind, but he's kind of lacking that heart, except for what the pigeon could bring through. And that turned out to be a key missing piece for what's going on in the world now. So how do you understand how his life at that time with you as a pigeon and your life now working with him in the way that you are now is all coming together to shift and change what's happening in the world now?
Yes, he was very close-hearted. Uh, Not to say he wasn't a kind and a sweet
Mhm.
gentleman, because that he was, but as far as allowing a love relationship into his life, allowing the depth of that human emotion of love into his life, he was very closed to that.
Mhm.
He was very much in his head. He was very much in his mind. And prior to him coming into my life in 2019, so was I. I was living, mm, um, I, I think what was a typical life for a lot of people in this society was a rather close-hearted way of being.
Mhm.
I was in my head, I was in my mind, always thinking, okay, what do I need to do next? How do I handle this or that situation in my life? And thinking everything through. And if my feelings came into the picture, uh, I had that concept that feelings are not important, feelings are not what are of value in this
Mhm.
life, feelings will not get me anywhere, my emotions, my heart will not get me anywhere in this life, my heart is not going to make a stable career, my heart is not going to allow me to bring income
Mhm.
or any semblance of security that we imagine that we need in this lifetime. And so I was very much living from that viewpoint as well. And so when he came into my life, he began to help me open up my heart. And then as I got to know him and open my heart to him, I realized that the most powerful way that I could be living my life in this physical reality was indeed through my emotions, through my passions,
Mhm.
through the heart energy. And as I began to open that up, I then learned to connect with him in that way. And through that heart energy connection, it allowed me to go back into his time and connect with him telepathically
Mhm.
time, even previous to when he met me as a pigeon. and began to open up his heart in his lifetime, which it's a complicated story, and I won't get into it just yet, but that led to a whole cascade of events in his lifetime, which allowed him ultimately to open up a new timeline reality for himself, in which he was open hearted, in which he was uniting both his mind and his heart
Mhm.
into a much more successful reality, which is what he's back there creating now.
Okay. So all of this is what fascinates me about your story and what it demonstrates to us is that all of this is happening, for you by working with his past self and then even further back with other past selves and then creating new timelines and all of these different things. But in that larger sense of if you move us out of time, all of this is happening at one time. And so it's a real time kind of thing that he was experiencing, having that exploring life from a closed heart, and then also learning to open his heart, and also then helping you to open your heart so that you can go back even further and help him open his heart to create new timelines for what we are to be able to create a different scenario of where we are now. Because part of what you're doing, if I remember correctly, is that you're beginning to move some timelines together. So the timeline that we know of with Nikola Tesla having had some magnificent inventions, but some pretty bad luck, and then also dying penniless and really not getting the recognition he deserved, with timelines in which he's in his heart things are working much better, and his dream of being able to bring free energy to humanity is much more on track than it was in the timeline that we know. So can you talk a little bit about how you both have been weaving these together and some of the adventure of doing that and meeting him at different ages?
Yes, yeah, it gets really confusing because, as you said, time is an illusion
Mm-hmm.
from a higher self soul perspective. All things are happening at once. There
Mm-hmm.
is no time. There is no actual past. And so when I say I go back into the past to visit him in this moment or that moment, I'm not actually really traveling anywhere.
Right.
I'm simply stepping into that
Mm-hmm.
different dimension of that moment, which is happening now. So I can simply step from my reality here, and I simply step back into whatever moment that I'm trying to go back to. And so yes, when I started traveling back to him, it was and to be honest, most of my travels back to him were of a love interest. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
my main motivation is I want to explore my relationship with him. I'm curious about who he is,
Mm-hmm.
about how he lives his life. I like watching him in his work. I like watching the way he thinks. I like seeing the way he interacts with people
Mm-hmm.
uh, because I love him. And so I will go back to probably what others think are totally random moments.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, like this is the heart of it. I want to go back to that moment where he told some reporter that inventors have too much passion and wild nature in them to ever be married.
Uh-huh.
And that if they got married, they would end up giving everything to the woman they love and
Mm-hmm.
leave nothing for their work. And
Oh.
so that's what so yeah, I wanted to step back to that moment. And that was one of the first moments that I went back to was right after he left that interview. So
Mm-hmm.
I go back and I'm like, Nicola, what do you mean by that? Why? Why would you not want to be with a woman? What do you mean your nature is so wild and passionate that you can't even be with somebody?
Hmm.
And he just looks at me and he pulls me into his arms and pulls me into his lap, and in his embrace he says, I would give you my own soul if I could.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a moment that I go back.
Well, because fundamentally, you're right. Your story with him is a love story and a story of opening the heart. And one of the things that it seems that Nicola's life was testament to of our historic times is the kind of suppression of the feminine, the suppression of the heart, the suppression of having the balance of masculine and feminine energies, so that it became about technological advancement. It became kind of cold-hearted. Everything was done from logic and rationality. And that actually his dream, to me anyway, that his dream of free energy for everybody, as much, or free energy for the world, as much as that is a technological dream, there's an essence of it that is also deeply rooted in mutual well-being, which is a deep, feminine heart related energy. But that didn't work during his lifetime in our historic reality. But you're saying that in this alternate timeline that well, let me get back to that for a second. So that didn't happen in our timeline. And we had lots of other things that happened that really began to suppress, the feminine energy in a time where it had been beginning to really rise. And so his was just one more casualty, and to me, of that particular pathway that humanity took, or at least Western humanity took. But in this new timeline that he's opened, where there is much more of a heart-based and heart-head harmony in what he's bringing forth into the world, how is that different than the timeline that we could look up in Wikipedia?
It's very different. And yeah, what happened as I went back and visited him
Mm-hmm.
at various, I jumped around in his timeline a lot. In fact, it was very confusing for him sometimes, because like, for example, I went to visit him in 1901,
Mm-hmm.
and that was it was about my second visit,
Mm-hmm.
in my attempts, and it was the first time that I had really tried, not in a less structured way, just to simply go back, because my previous time I had gone through like this whole shamanic journey,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and but this time I was simply in my meditation. I'm like, I'm going to simply step back. And so when I stepped back and landed in 1901, I was a little bit confused myself, and I
Mm-hmm.
was a little bit disoriented, and it wasn't the year that I was trying to go back to.
Oh, that's interesting.
It wasn't where I was trying to go back to. And so I landed in the streets of New York, and I'm like, "Oh, I don't know how to find him." And so I just start calling his name.
Uh-huh. Oh my
And
gosh.
I was close enough to his lab that he comes
Mm-hmm.
out, that it's just like, a few feet away from me, but I didn't know where to go. And so he comes out the door and he's like, "Darling, what are you doing out here?" And he leads me up to his laboratory, and we start talking.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, "Oh, and I'm clearly confused and disoriented. I'm like, "Oh, this is exciting, getting to see you for the first time like this." And he looks at me, and he asks, "Well, what do you mean? You've been to visit me several times."
Oh my
And
gosh.
I was like, "I have?" Like, I I didn't know. And so it was a little confusing, and it took me,
Uh-huh.
um yeah, it took me several visits to kind of get oriented to the way that jumping back and forth into his
Mm-hmm.
timeline worked,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to keep track of it and the time paradoxes, which which the version of Nicola who was with me here in my lifetime here, who I had called in as a sort of spirit guide,
Mm-hmm.
he was like, Amber, don't think too hard about the paradoxes. You're going to
Right.
hurt your brain. It's very confusing if you think about it in the way that you're trying to, which was linear time. It
Mm-hmm.
just does not make sense in that context. Don't think about it too hard. Just do it. Just go experience. Just go have your experiences. Don't overthink it. And what happened is, in my stepping back into those journeys, there was one day I asked him, I'm like, I'm not ready to leave my journeying just yet. I want to go visit you in your time. Just send me back to whatever time that you think that would be best. Like, surprise me. Right. And so I stepped back into his timeline,
Mm-hmm.
not having any particular target, just trusting that Nicola would guide me to whatever moment that he chose.
Mm-hmm.
And I stepped into what was his hotel room, and I came upon a very sad, tearful Nicola, who was as depressed as had ever seen him.
Oh.
And I asked him, I'm like, and I had a feeling right away what this was about, but I asked him, I'm like, well, what happened? Or, are you all right? What's going on? And he was like, my laboratory just burned down.
Wow.
Right. And
Mm-hmm.
that was in March of 1895. And his laboratory had just been burnt to the ground, and he'd basically lost all his work, and it set him back financially as well. It was a major setback, both in terms of the trajectory of his technological work,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and his finances, but also a huge setback in his morale.
I bet, yeah. But
And
he knew who you were during that when you arrived in that lifetime.
by 1895, I had visited him like maybe 3 or 4 times.
Mm-hmm. Because
And
there was one
Mhm.
point at which you introduced yourself to him and he didn't know who you were.
Yes,
Okay.
that
Because so this is
that was
fascinating
yeah,
because
that
we
was
talk about this time stuff and that he recognized you even though it was the first or second time you'd gone back because you'd been back, quote unquote before, but not in your current experience where you kind of jumped around at different things. So he was aware of you and you weren't aware that he was aware of you then. But there
yes.
was a time that you introduced yourself to him. How did that go?
Okay, so similar. I have these crystals that help me travel back,
Mm-hmm.
and I had consulted my crystals, and out of, again, sheer curiosity, I was wondering, okay, at what age do I actually get to start meeting him? And I asked my crystals, okay, send me back to the earliest moment in which I meet him. And on the surface, I know that that's kind of a confusing request, because
Mm-hmm.
then my very going back, it becomes the earliest time that I meet him. But I'm like, again, try not to overthink it. Just, dear crystals, please send me back to the earliest time that I get to meet him.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I landed up in 1886. And I know the years because I ask him.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, like, I really don't know the context.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I go back, and, I kind of I'm usually I end up in a hallway of some hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what happened this time. And so I knock, and I just kind of feel my way. I sense, okay, which door is his?
Mm-hmm.
And then I knock on the door, call out, Nicola, and he answers. And this time, um, he opens a door and he's looking confused. And I just kind of barge in, um, kind of taking it for granted that he would even have any idea who this woman is that's showing up on his doorstep.
Uh-huh.
And I start jabbering away, and I'm like, oh, hi, Nico. And he's looking really young. To me, he's looking younger than he had like in my other visits. So
Uh-huh.
I was pretty excited about that. And I'm like, oh, hey, how are you? And he's just like silent, looking very confused. And and so I'm like, oh, what year is it? Because that's what I wanted to know how early I went back. And I'm like, oh, what year is it? He's like, 1886. And I look at his expression and I like kind of start realizing that, oh, he doesn't actually know who I am. But nevertheless, I start talking as if he knows me.
Mm-hmm.
And I start talking about, I'm like, oh, 1886. Oh, aren't you building your motors? You've met Westinghouse and you're building your motors and stuff by now. And he looks at me even more confused. And after this meditation, I went back into his biography and I realized that I was off by like a year and a half or so.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he had not yet met Westinghouse or started on building his motors. And in fact, this was just prior to that, where at the time that he was digging ditches in New York.
Okay. Yeah.
And so
Wow.
he looks super confused and he's like, and he's like, about my motor? And I'm like, well, everybody, that's why you're famous.
Oh my God.
And I just like, I couldn't have possibly botched the conversation further.
Uh-huh.
The whole thing must have been such a confusing mess for him. And by the time that I left, he was just like, he had his poor eyebrows were knit together in a complete state of perplexity. And that's
Oh my
pretty much
gosh.
how I left him.
Oh, that is so funny. Well, okay, so I want to get back for a moment because we touched on it and then we left. And I
Mhm.
want to kind of wrap up with this piece. And then I want to have a deeper conversation about the nature of time and time travel, because what you're doing is so opposite of what we've always been, quote unquote, told by, the scary sci-fi stuff. So in the timeline that got activated, that Tesla's heart was open and things are moving differently and unfolding differently than they did in the timeline that we can Wikipedia. How has that unfolded, and what difference has it made to have him be balanced in his heart and his mind in this particular timeline?
It's made all the difference in the world. In fact, the first thing that the way that I worked with him, so it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
just me going back. Of course, it was under his guidance. But in getting him to make that transition from, the timeline that we can look up in Wikipedia, in which
Mm-hmm.
his laboratory burnt down, his tower got destroyed. He had some success, but his major projects that were his real dream were basically, not allowed to come through yet
Mm-hmm.
for various reasons. And so when we made that transition, the the point at which we did that did revolve around the fire happening. So just prior to the fire happening, I went back into the fire happened in March 1895.
Mm-hmm.
I went back November 1894 and had a series of conversations with him about this time. I was much more thorough about introducing myself and
Uh-huh.
who I was, how he knew me,
Mm-hmm.
why I was coming to visit him.
Mm-hmm.
And the final conversation was about the fire that was about to happen
Mm-hmm.
and how he could connect to his higher self,
Mm-hmm.
to his future self,
Mm-hmm.
and stop that from happening. Because his future self, the version that was talking to me and interacting with me,
Mm-hmm.
was trying to go back to his younger self, but his younger self was so caught up in his mind
Mm-hmm.
and in his technology, in his experiments, that he was not being open-hearted enough to feel into it and to hear the message from his higher self. that, hey, I want to get your attention. Things are about to go very awry,
Mm-hmm.
and you can change it. But he wasn't listening to that. And so I was sent back to get his attention,
Mm-hmm.
which I did. And uh, I, and yeah, and through that series of conversations, he opened his heart up to me enough that then he was able to connect with his higher self. And his higher self was able to tell him, hey, look, what's going to happen. And you can change this. Let's do this a little differently this time. And what ultimately happened was that fire, which happened in this timeline that we're on,
Mm-hmm.
he was able to stop it. And he was able to stop it by going and making certain business deals, which prior to that he had rejected. He had
Mm-hmm.
rejected the business deals and the negotiations with other people, the involvement of other people in his work. He had avoided all that
Mm-hmm.
previously, but this time around, he finally realized the essence of that he needed to work with others in his time in order to collaborate and bring about his projects in a more successful way. And so he was able to get those people who, in our timeline, had burnt his lab down. But this time he collaborated with them enough. And he told me that first it was a very uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
business relationship in doing that. But he collaborated with them enough to not get his laboratory burnt down. And since that time, of 1895, where he successfully collaborated with them and negotiated with them in other deals so that they did not view him any longer as a threat to
Mm-hmm.
their bottom line, but instead as an asset and a potential profit maker
Mm-hmm.
to them. And so his interactions with them began changing right away, his interactions with the other people in his time. And he's now coming to me from his time of 1899, and he's saying his relationships have altered to the degree that he has a much better balance in his
Mm-hmm.
life. He makes time for his friendships in a way that he hadn't. And he's a little bit more business savvy. Is still not his favorite thing,
Mm-hmm.
um, but he's learning to be in a relationship
Mm-hmm.
in healthier ways and bringing that into his business relationships such that he's able to work better with those people back then, uh, to bring greater success to and in a mutual way. It's a
Mm-hmm.
mutual benefit for him and his technology, and to those others who really only saw the bottom line as the main factor.
Well, and it really demonstrates too the subtle but profound difference it makes when you begin to attend to the feminine in complement to the masculine, even in things like business, which we tend to think of in terms, of masculine and competition and bottom line and that sort of thing, and how destructive that was and has been in many ways. And how, when you are more balanced in that you can then be in collaboration more so than competition and begin to work in mutual well-being as opposed to my well-being versus your well-being. So it seems very nuanced at the surface, that he has more time for relationships and he's attending to his friendships and, becoming a better relationship partner in business. But such a difference that makes over the long term, which will be interesting to see. And I want to talk about in our next conversation. I'm just going to give a little teaser about how the two of you are working together in and through time to actually shift time, which is not something that, we're supposed to be wanting to do or doing. So that's going to be for our next conversation. But I do want to give you a chance to say anything else that you would like to about your love relationship in with Nicola, or anything else that you want to say before we finish up here.
It is something that in our society, I think at times, like you said, is considered the inconsequential thing, the
Mm-hmm,
heart, the relationships. Uh, but when you really look at that factor of the emotional well-being of people, and the dynamic of what a healthy relationship brings into the world, like when you're in love, when you're in a healthy relationship, whether you're a man or a woman, I isn't it just your whole everything else in your life just goes better, just goes smoothly,
yes.
if you're satisfied and at peace in your heart, then you're in harmony with others.
Mm-hmm,
And I can get into it a little bit next time about the way that the feminine energy has come into his life more completely versus the timeline, like you said, that you look up at Wikipedia. And in the timeline that existed, before he was heart open,
mm-hmm,
uh, yeah, you can find news articles about him ranting about women.
mm-hmm,
And, he had some very or I would say, unhealthy views on feminine and on feminism, even,
mm-hmm.
and on, women's place in the world. And since becoming more open hearted, of course, that's shifting. And one of the things that he's told me that he's become more a man of peace and more settled in his heart,
Mm-hmm.
because he's conquered his greatest fear. And that fear was allowing that heart energy, allowing the feminine aspect of that into his life. That was for him his greatest fear. And once he allowed that, he was able to step more fully into his passions, which were now not fueled only by his logical mind, but now also by his heart energy. And so the mind, coupled with the passion coming from the heart,
Mm-hmm.
is allowing him to be far more expressive in his inventions, in his relationships, in just his day-to-day life.
Well, and that's beautifully said. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we are having as a collective humanity right now, is really opening up to that heart space. And even the words or the phrase "in love," we tend to put that only in the terms of romance. And truly, though, what it means to be in love is to be in that the frequency of love, the vibration of love, the energy of love, which allows everything to flow better. And it allows relationships, obviously, to flow better, but it allows your whole life to flow better. And it allows us to flow better as a community, whether it's your local community or your family community, or the global community. And so I see what his shift has been as something that is kind of a template for what we all can do and can be as we begin to open more and more to the heart and to love and to bringing that balance into our individual lives and also into our shared humanity. So thank you for
Yes.
the work that you're doing with him.
Oh, thank you. And can you imagine a world in which all of us are doing truly what we love?
Yeah. Oh, wouldn't that be
And
fabulous?
yes, and being in love, yeah, we would all be creating a beautiful, beautiful reality.
I think so too. All right. Well, I thank you so much for talking with me today. And we're going to have our next conversation here soon. And I also wanted to invite people to check out my Clubhouse. I'm new to Clubhouse, so, give me a little bit of slack there. But I'm going to be talking to some of our guests, including Amber, on Clubhouse as we move forward. So check out my Clubhouse. It's under Christine Madeira. And I'll have a page up on my website here soon that will have the Clubhouse scheduled, whatever they call them, events, rooms, meetings. I don't know. I'm that new. And, and join us and join the conversation. And it should be a lot of fun. And you can also find Amber's information on conversationsfromtheedge.net. I'll also put the Clubhouse information on there. But do you want to tell people the name of your YouTube channel? Because you actually do a podcast that talks about this relationship with Nikola Tesla.
Yes, I've recently started a YouTube channel which specifically explores my relationship with Nicola and my relationship with myself, as this is a journey of self-discovery and falling in love with myself as well as him. So that is Journey of the Dove on YouTube. And you can also reach me at journeyofthedove@gmail.com if anybody wishes to reach out to me.
All right. And we'll have both of those on conversationsfromtheedge.net as well. Thank you, Amber. It's been wonderful talking with you, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, as am I.
This is your host, Christine Madeira. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.